We're going to start. So good morning, everyone. Your Excellency, the Ambassador of the United Kingdom, Mr. Matthew Lodge, Mr. Sean Kidney, Head of Climate Bond Initiative, dear partners of the Institute of Energy for Southeast Europe, ladies and gentlemen, a warm welcome to all to today's conference, which our Institute is organizing in partnership with Climate Bond Initiative under the auspices of the British Embassy in Athens. An event whose theme is green financing opportunities, focusing on Greece and Southeast Europe with special reference to green bonds, a relatively new form of financing clean energy projects. As the world becomes more aware of the vagaries of human intervention and the resulting climate change, defined mechanisms which maintain the balance in the biosphere come under huge strain. Hence, the need to accelerate our turn towards clean energy solutions in order to produce much-needed power to enable our economy and society, if you like, to function. Against the continuing abuse of our environment and the continuing increase of greenhouse gas emissions, we have the positive change in investment policies which has been gathering pace over the last few years. Last year, we witnessed higher investment in global level in energy efficiency and renewable energy sources, which took the lion's share out of total investment in the energy sector. According to the International Energy Agency's World Energy Investment 2022 report, the global energy investment was set to rise over 8% in 2022 to a total $2.4 trillion. That was the total investment in 2022, based on preliminary figures, of course. But the important thing that this level of investment was well above pre-COVID levels. Out of this, 472 billion went to renewables, 470 to energy efficiency, 93 to electric vehicles, 377 billion to electric grids and storage, which are getting more and more important for clean energy, and 19 billion to low carbon fuels and CCUS, carbon capture and storage systems. That is a total of 1 trillion, which corresponds to 60% of the total global energy investment. So it shows clearly where the tide is turning. But the numbers and more project-related information will become known in the course of the day thanks to our excellent group of speakers and panelists. Without further ado, now let me give the floor to His Excellency, the British Ambassador, Mr. Matthew Lodge, whom I wish to thank publicly for encouraging us to go ahead and organize today's event. Ambassador, you have the floor.
Well, thank you very much, Kostis, and good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's a great pleasure to be with you here this morning, and let me start off by thanking Kostis and ENA for the initiative and the drive to make today's event happen. And I'm particularly grateful to him, to the Institute, but to all our other collaborators this morning. Very nice to have you here, Sean, and thank you, of course, to the Athens Club for your support. Ladies and gentlemen, I think the need to address climate change, biodiversity loss and environmental degradation is, beyond doubt, transforming the global economy. As countries, companies and individuals across the world respond to the challenges, finance and investment have a crucial role to play, and the UK can make a significant offer and contribution to that. The global transition to a net zero, resilient and nature-positive economy will see trillions of pounds reallocated and invested in new projects, products and services. The UK's world-renowned financial services sector can put us at the forefront of this transition. And an increasing number of governments across the world and businesses and financial institutions are bringing sustainability to the heart of their operations in order effectively to manage these global challenges and the risks entailed in that, and to ensure long-term prosperity. From our point of view, we are very pleased that many of the sustainable finance initiatives that were started in the UK, whether CDP, PRI or TCFD, for those of you who are expert in such acronyms, have indeed been adopted by policymakers and regulators globally. And of course, successive UK governments have been in the forefront of taking action to green the financial system. In 2012, with the world's first green investment bank based in Edinburgh. In 2019, with its green finance strategy and the Green Finance Institute, a public-private one-stop shop to bring together key players across the green finance ecosystem in the UK and internationally. And in 2021, with securing unprecedented industry backing for a net zero future through the COP26 private finance campaign's $130 trillion program, 40% of the world's financial assets by some estimates, now being committed to net zero. And London ranking, of course, as the world's leading green finance centre. And there's more. With its green financing programme, the key pillar of the government's green finance agenda, which allows the UK to issue sovereign green bonds, or green gilts, and retail green savings bonds. So financing raised through the programme helps to finance government expenditure that tackles climate change, biodiversity loss, and other environmental challenges. And then just last year, in 2022, our Treasury, our Finance Ministry, being recognised for its global leadership in green finance by winning 2 honours at the 2022 Climate Bonds Award, which celebrates best practice and innovation in green finance, and about which I'm sure we will hear more today. So, as the UK government's representative here in Greece, I'm pleased that our ambition is to be a global standard bearer for green finance. And it's an ambition that is not just at the heart of government, but throughout other institutions in the United Kingdom. The Bank of England is fully behind helping the UK financial and international sectors to be well prepared so that we can be, not just in words but in reality, a global leader in transformation towards a low-carbon economy with all its associated risks and challenges. And as early as 2015, the London Stock Exchange became the first major stock exchange to launch a dedicated green bond segment, establishing strict admission criteria. And the LSE is now home to a diversified range of green, social and sustainability bonds that have raised over £27 billion for supranational institutions, governments and corporates. My colleagues back in the UK at the Department for Business and Trade and the team here in the Embassy have already supported UK green funds investing in Greece, such as Next Energy Capital's third solar infrastructure fund, which has made solar and battery storage acquisitions in Greece. Next Power 3 ESG funds acquisitions include 6 utility-scale solar photovoltaic projects, totaling some 132 megawatts, and a majority investment in 6 standalone battery storage projects, totaling 400 megawatts. And Whatcrop, a Greek startup that expanded in the UK, has partnered with Zero Generation UK, a Macquarie Green Investment Group portfolio company, on one of the largest renewable energy developers internationally, aiming to develop renewable energy and energy storage projects, mainly here in Southeast Europe and in the United Kingdom. But the team don't stop there. They're also looking out for green sustainability projects in Greece that may qualify for overseas direct investment support or prosperity fund investment, particularly if they are a UK project developer, equipment supplier or financial institution, be that bank lenders, insurance providers or others. We're also looking at whether UK export financing can help being involved in financing such projects, and we're working with them and contractors to explore the scope for closer partnerships. And we're considering which projects and financial institutions here in Greece might benefit from the expertise of the UK insurance industry in green, sustainability and resilience issues. So there is much on our plate, but much to do. So ladies and gentlemen, the UK government's Green Finance Strategy, released just last week, sets out how we want to use the expertise and our example of our financial sector in the UK to help accelerate the shift to a green global financial system and to catalyse green financing more widely, including in emerging and developing markets. The next 3 decades will see the biggest changes to industry since the 19th century as we move from a fossil fuel-driven economy to a decarbonised one that leaves our environment in a better state than we found it. That is the challenge. Our ability to exploit the opportunities of this new green industrial revolution will depend on our readiness to finance it. And more on that this morning. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, from my part as well. Let me welcome you here in this very interesting small conference of IENE. Our first speaker is Mr. Sean Kidney. Sean Kidney is the co-founder and CEO of Climate Bonds Initiative, an initiative that is aiming in attracting the financial community towards all the challenges of climate change projects and investments. He is one of the extremely charismatic people that are driving this effort towards a better world. Sean, it's you.
Thanks, Thomas. I'm going to use the mic and stand. Thanks for being here today. We have a very specific objective, which is to boom green finance in Greece and Southeast Europe. So that means we need you, hopefully, to leave here feeling like there are opportunities that are going to work for your organisation. That also means questions. If you have questions, if you're querying, if you want to find out something, today is the time to do it. Put your hand up and ask. And I would prefer to hear more from you than from us, frankly. So interrupt us. Say, hang on, that was rubbish. Go back to that. Please, be proactive. The reason I'm here is that the green bonds market has grown since we set ourselves up. Some, when was it, 14 years ago in London, another UK origin organisation, from $2 billion outstanding to $2.5 trillion outstanding. It's been the fastest growing asset class on the planet. We had a tough year last year because global bond markets went down the chute. You know why. However, green bonds and sustainable bonds, their sister, continued to grow globally in market share. And in fact, we had some amazing things happen last year. We had, in the second half of last year, a whole lot of bond issuances were pulled from global markets, but not a single green bond issuance was pulled. They all successfully placed at very attractive rates around the world. And that's essentially what's going on. That sums it up. Access to capital and other benefits are enhanced by doing growth. It doesn't replace creditworthiness. I mean, hey, I still need to make the budgets work if I'm an investor. But it gives greater access to capital if you're looking for capital. And of course, it's also beneficial for governments that are trying to shift capital into climate-related activities to address public policy requirements because it's fiscally efficient. Because if they can bring in some small, modest measures to move capital, we see capital moving in different places. Whether that be Christine Lagarde talking about green asset purchasing, whether it be the UK Treasury issuing green bonds to provide liquidity and benchmark pricing to the market, or whether it be the regulators, the People's Bank of China, who've actually provided discount capital at the liquidity lending window of the central bank if you post green bonds as collateral. 1% discount wholesale capital for banks. It's quite a powerful incentive. That's why China is the world's second largest green bond market. So I work as an advisor to the European Commission. I came up with this idea of taxonomy 10 years ago. I'm sorry, everyone. My apologies. Yes, exactly. I'm to blame. But we'll get there. We'll make it better, honestly. Nevertheless, it's been a significant driver because it's the idea of taxonomy is a common language across the industry. The idea of a shopping list, what we've got to do to make it easier. It will, once we get it working better, this is this year's job in Brussels, be much simpler and easier for you to use going forward. I'm an advisor of the People's Bank of China, and in 2014 I recommended they set up a green bond market when we did a green finance task force, and they have, and it's now grown enormously. I'm an advisor to the Singapore Central Bank on sustainable finance, etc., etc. I'm privileged to be here for one reason, I have to say, which is that the Institute has become a licensed climate bonds verifier. So in other words, there's someone local that can be looked at, that can be spoken to and get advice from about how to issue green bonds and to get the necessary paperwork involved to be able to participate in this. It's not complicated, but there is paperwork involved. That's why I'm here today, to support them and hopefully to be able to presage the issuance of a sovereign green bond from the government, which I'm expecting will happen in the quarter after the election. But let's see how we go. This is a market which is global. It's not just European, although Europe now is 50% of global issuance. It wasn't at the beginning. It's also in India, it's in Chile, it's in Canada, it's in the US as well. The US dollar is the second largest currency market. It's very much something that has gone across emerging markets as well as the developed markets, is the key point to make. It's a very simple idea driven by investors. It's not been driven by governments. It's not been driven by activists. It's been driven by investors. And there's a very simple reason. They're concerned around climate change. They've had difficulty knowing what to do. Institutional investors, not retail, institutional investors have long-term assets and liabilities matching challenges. If you're an actuary and you're looking at a 30-year table, I'm going to tell you that there is one elephant that's hard to avoid, which is the impact of climate change on portfolios going forward. On current trajectories of climate change, we will see wholesale portfolio decimation over the next 30 years because of the nature of volatility and impacts on the world economy. Now, this is a difficult challenge for investors because they run their portfolios using modern portfolio management theory, which typically has a 5-year horizon. So you've got the portfolio managers at the front and you've got the actuaries at the back. The actuaries are saying, we've got to do something. And the portfolio manager says, yeah, but what? My models don't allow me to do anything. This is challenging. Here comes a green bond. Because a green bond does two things. It has similar risk yield features of a standard bond, plus a bonus feature, which is the proceeds go to addressing a long-term risk, climate-related investments. It's a very simple idea. And on the back of it being such a simple idea, it has grown rapidly. As you know, simple things are the things that work in marketing. So it's a crude idea. Now, what that means is for a portfolio manager, they can switch green and vanilla in a portfolio easily because they perform this much the same. There are some differences showing now. They've got liquidity. I'll come to that. But it's an easy decision to make. They don't need to go to a credit committee and say, well, we're going to invest to save the planet, Lillian, and so would you allow us to take a haircut? I mean, no one ever wins that argument. I mean, I wish they did. I wish they did because there are reasons to do it, but let's be realistic. And this is the tragedy of the commons, right? Any individual investor can't make a decision that'll change the world. And as a result, they don't stick their neck out, apart from a few small impact investors. If we're to try and get the massive capital moving, we need to allow them to make decisions using the existing methodologies that will also have a bigger impact. And that's what a green bond is. A green bond is not the final solution, by the way, to this. The final solution will be governments acting. Let's be clear about this. You know, energy policy is the province of governments. We can be much more aggressive in energy policy in pretty well every country in the world about changing. That's a discussion for the policy side of it. Around transfer policy, we need to make sure that we stop driving our cars, or at least if we do, they're electric. Norway chose to have significant tax incentives for electric vehicles over the last 10 years. And now the bulk of cars sold in Norway are electric, and they will stop the sale of petrol-based cars in Norway within 2 years. Now, Norway is not a small country like Luxembourg. They don't have range anxiety. They are driving long distances. They've got electric charging based on current cars. So it's possible. It's entirely possible. And the net tax from cars has still been much the same. For Norway, they've just shifted the burden to petrol cars through this process. There are ways that governments can act on transport. There are ways that governments can act on agriculture. Not just because we need to deal with mitigation in agriculture. There are decisions to be made there. Certain sorts of practices, such as open ploughing of fields, are very bad for the release of carbon. If you use seeding techniques, which use a needle into the soil, some of you will know this, rather than breaking the soil, that avoids carbon loss. So in Australia, 60% of all farmers now use seeding techniques which have a needle going into the soil. 40% are still using open ploughing. That's got to change everywhere. There are lots and lots of measures that governments can encourage in different sorts of ways across the economy. It's not just energy. But energy is still the first place to start. The context, therefore, to the green bond market is climate, as Costa said earlier. It's about making sure that people can meet their short-term commitments whilst also addressing long-term. We have been able to get a market that has preferencing now. When this started, this was about flat-priced bonds coming to market. The market took off for commercials when the IFC, International Finance Corporation, issued two $1 billion bonds in 2013. They were 2.5 times oversubscribed in 1.5 hours. That was very exciting for underwriters. Very quickly after that, corporate bonds started growing, but they were flat priced market, same as other bonds. As we've got liquidity, we've discovered something happening in the secondary market. And this, thank you, stock exchanges. And Lillian was part of the team at the London Stock Exchange at that time when we first met that was promoting trading of green bonds and helped with that liquidity price discovery. What we found is that investors treated green bonds differently. It's a bit like having a bonus feature. You know, if Matthew has an ordinary bond and this other bond has a free set of cutlery, he'll keep the other bond when he sells off his bonds. It's a bit like that. As a result, whenever there's a downturn in the market, green bonds hold their value. Interesting. And in fact, when markets have frozen, such as in March 2020, green bonds stayed liquid. People were willing to keep selling them at a premium value. Their value didn't drop. They stayed liquid, but at a premium value. What we see now on average in the secondary market is differential performance, despite the same full credit rating or credit worthiness. So green bonds are more valuable. One of the reasons for that, and one of the reasons the pricing is there, is that bond investors are defensive. Larry Fink, the head of BlackRock, once said that he didn't make money by giving his investors yield. He made money by making sure his investors didn't lose money. Now, if you've got a product, a bond, which is less likely to lose value every time there's a downturn, for a defensive fixed income investor, that is gold dust. This is superior product. And that means they're willing to bid tighter at primary. So when you see now tighter prices at primary for green, it's not sentiment. as much as I wish it were, it's not because investors want to save the planet, it's because these are worth more in the secondary market. And in fact, if you look at the pricing, and we publish a pricing report every 6 months, the differential between secondary market and primary market is roughly half. In other words, let's take the German green bond, which is a negative interest rate bond. It trades at a 5 basis points benefit in the secondary market to vanilla and 2 basis points tighter pricing in primary. In other words, investors split the difference of the issuer. It becomes a win-win. The investors get some benefit and the issuers get some benefit. And that's characteristic in most markets now. The Indian green bond, sovereign, was issued in rupees recently. It got a 6 basis points benefit at primary in domestic Indian markets. Banks in India have been telling me for years, oh, investors in India, they don't care. No. This is a European thing. We killed that off that idea with this Indian sovereign. And now, in the weeks afterwards, Marina here, who's running our certification, can report to you we got calls from a wide range of public institutions in India about green bond issuance as a result, because there's actually something on the table. In euros, there is definitely something on the table. So that's the background to it. Of course, the real background is climate. This is all very well getting a green bond market, but 2.5 trillion is only a drop in the water. We need to be getting about 5 trillion a year to be making a real impact. We are not doing well on climate. We have, well, according to the IPCC, if you said the report a couple of weeks ago, we have to reduce emissions 50% by 2030 globally. We have not reduced emissions over the last 20 years. We've flatlined them. That was a win. But now we have to go off a cliff and dramatically reduce them. That does mean, unfortunately, stopping all fossil fuel exploration of all kinds, starting with coal, no new coal plants. In fact, in the West, coal plants need to disappear by 2035, preferably by 2030, which is going to be a challenge, as you will appreciate. And in emerging markets, they have to disappear by 2040. I've just come from Indonesia, where the Indonesian government is saying, you know what, I think we're going to be using coal till 2080 because it's so cheap here. So we've got some policy challenges. And you can understand it from their perspective. We didn't create climate change. That was the Europeans, the Americans, the Chinese. Why can't we keep using coal? So we have to make financially viable solutions available to the Indonesians to make sure they can choose other pathways. In every country, this is going to be part of the challenge. It'll be the major economies of the world that drive the movement of capital in a direction which meets the needs of countries like Indonesia while also making sure that pathway is green. That'll be Europe, the US, China, and Japan. We are, unfortunately, on a path to go well beyond 1.5 degrees Celsius warming, if you're familiar with that figure. That's still our target. That needs to be our target. Because to get emissions down, stabilise the climate, we've got to bring it back down to 1.5. That will require in the 2030s and 2040s, a lot of sequestration, reforestation, carbon capture and sequestration, and so on. In the meantime, we have to expect the temperatures are going to go up to 2 degrees. This is going to be very, very difficult for Greece. We are going to see some extreme heat in summer. We kind of have to prepare. There's a thing called wet bulb temperature, which is now becoming a common term in the climate change literature. This is when the relationship between heat and humidity means humans stop perspiring. Once you stop perspiring, you've only got about 6 hours to live. We expect to have wet bulb temperatures, which do occasionally happen in the world, become a common feature of summers around the world over the next 15 years. The places that will be most impacted will be places like India, the whole Ganga Valley, southwest and southeast USA, MENA, the Gulf area, and so on. If people can't find a cool place, a basement or an air-conditioned building, assuming the power grid holds and these things, then they are at risk of dying. We've seen a few spotty deaths. When Kuwait had its 56-degree temperatures a couple of years ago, you heard reports of a couple of workmen who were still outside working, dying in the heat. What they died of was wet bulb temperature. That is, they weren't able to perspire, and they were still working at the time. But this is spotty so far. The risk is that we have incidents which last a long time. You might remember last year, I think it was, we had the heat dome in British Columbia. One of my staff works in Vancouver, and she reported to me that it was 47 degrees Celsius in Vancouver, which is not a place known for its heat. She had to find a hotel where the air conditioner was working, where she could leave her 2 young kids and the father while she sheltered in the basement of a house. Outside of Vancouver, we had a wildfire start spontaneously in a town, destroyed the whole town, killed people, 50 degrees Celsius heat. That's in Vancouver. That sort of thing is going to become common. We've seen, of course, terrible fires in Greece in the very recent past. So we need to prepare for this. What does it mean? Well, clearly it means investment in fire brigades. What does that mean? There's all that sort of stuff. And the whole forest management stuff. But for our cities, it means thermal insulation. It means trees. It means a transformation of the urban environment. It means looking for low energy air conditioning systems. You know, in the 10 years prior to 2020, we installed more air conditioning capacity on the planet than we did renewable energy capacity. This is not good for shifting off fossil fuels. Now, if we could make that air conditioning efficient, and there are many tools around where we could be using 1/3 the amount of power to do it, that would free up energy to be able to replace fossil fuels. There's work to be done which is going to require governments to act. One thing that's certain, over the last 2.5 years, is changes are coming. The Biden Climate Summit saw all the world's developed countries commit to strong 2030 targets, not 2050, which is frankly a bit academic if we don't meet our 2030 targets. It's the 2030 targets that count. Will they all be met? We don't know, but we do know everyone is now acting. Europe committed before anyone. The UK, of course, as well. Amongst investors globally, and in our own infrastructure, we have about $160 trillion of investors represented in the associations on the Climate Bond Standards Board. Amongst investors globally, there is now certainty that the future will be green. The future has been decided. The question now is the speed of change and trying to figure out who are the winners and who are the losers. This is a challenge for investors. It's difficult. We are entering a period of extreme turmoil. Some of that turmoil because of climate impacts, some of that will be because the change of the economy driven by policy imperatives. How do we navigate through this? You know, in September of 2021, we had 2 epochal milestone moments, one on the London Stock Exchange and one on the New York Stock Exchange, when the capitalisation of Ørsted, a wind energy company that started as a coal energy company 25 years ago, overtook the capitalisation of BP, an oil company. And in the US, NextEra, a renewable energy company, which started as a coal company 25 years ago, overtook the capitalisation of Exxon, which when I was a kid was the biggest company in the world. These were incredible moments. Now, of course, it's gone like that since then, thanks to the invasion of the Ukraine. But you can sort of see how the world is changing. For an investor, how do they pick the Ørsteds, the NextEras, let alone the Teslas of the world, and ride this tsunami that is coming through the global economy versus avoiding the ones where we're going to see value destruction? And we will see a lot of value destruction and change going through. This is a challenge. One of the ways of looking at it is where the prioritisation of activity has to be. This is what we try to do in the European Union taxonomy of sustainable finance. Essentially, it's a shopping list for the future. If you're an investor, you look at this list and you think, okay, that is lower risk. It doesn't mean I don't have to deal with the creditworthiness, but if I look at this, I can think, well, this is what is the society is likely to do because these are the solutions to climate. They are less likely to be negatively impacted by policy. If I'm not on that list, if something is on that list, there's more chance it'll be negatively impacted by policy. One thing I can tell you for certain, fossil fuels will continue to be negatively impacted by policy because of the rising climate targets. And I've got 2 friends here who from gas company in the Mediterranean. there is clearly money to be made. But what I'm saying to bankers around the world around with gas is you will make money for the next 6 or 7 years, but there's a real risk after 2030. Substantial risk. Long-term contracts are going to be difficult to sign for a number of reasons. Partly on the proactive side, because governments are now allowing investments and technologies allowing investments in solutions like hydrogen, which is dropping in price, green hydrogen, dropping in price so fast that it's going to be cheaper than gas by 2026, is what I'm being told by the producers. We had Adani in India who tells me they're delivering green hydrogen to market at 97 cents a kilo in 2026, which is an extraordinary low price, earth-shattering price. In the US, the IRA, the Tax Act, has got massive subsidies for green hydrogen. So the world's largest green hydrogen plant is currently being built in Oklahoma, which will deliver green hydrogen at an extraordinarily low price. That company will make money before it ships 1 kilo of green hydrogen, thanks to the tax credits. And that's an example of what governments are starting to do. They're providing tax credits. The Japanese government has now got a $150 billion fund specifically to promote green technologies and to grant and lend money to companies making a switch. This is happening all over the place. China, we see here headlines around coal plants, partly because China had such bad climate impacts last summer, where the Three Gorges Dam failed, people were dying in the streets of Chongqing from 50 degrees Celsius heat, air conditioning uses through the roof. They didn't have enough power. So they decided to build some coal and also a whole lot of renewables. They put more money into renewables every single year for the last 15 years than any other country in the world. And they've upped at 50% in the last 12 months. China, like Europe, is a group of provinces and member states fighting of each other. They're making some bad decisions. They could be investing in grids to connect their renewables. They haven't got a good power system between provinces yet. It's all provincial based, a bit like Poland has its own power system and hasn't got enough interconnectors to Germany. Or Greece hasn't got enough interconnectors around. Exactly the same problem in China. But the change, like in Europe, is happening in China as well in practice. Every major country in the world is changing. Our question is, how do we pick the future? The capital required is extraordinary. McKinsey says $9.2 trillion a year needed just for mitigation. Luckily, we have the capital. We are capital rich in this world. We have more capital than ever before in human history. And lots of it is in places where it shouldn't be. Stuck in cash management trusts in the US or in German bunds, negative interest rate. That's not a good way to pay our pensions. It needs yield. And it wants green. The green bond market is first and foremost proof, evidence that investors will shift when they're given the chance. I got asked by someone from the Bank of England recently, how many green bonds could we place if we had them? Because the problem is supply. I said, I have no doubt we could place $10 trillion of green bonds tomorrow. The investor appetite in all major economies is so strong. The challenge is the availability of supply. The challenge is renewable energy companies issuing so people can buy, or banks, or whatever. So the main job I'm here today is to encourage people to participate in this particular market. Look, in a sense, I don't care if it's labelled green. I just care if the investment is made. But investors love the labelling. It makes it easy for them to explain to their beneficiaries, to their asset owners, what it is. They like the protocol. They like the intentionality, as they call it, of the nature of the bond. This is, we are promising to only do X, Y, and Z. It makes reporting easier. That's why the format works. And of course, it allows governments to bring in incentives. So we've now got green bond credit enhancement schemes of a variety of sorts. The Greek government, if it wanted, could apply to GG reform in Brussels to have a green bond market development scheme to provide technical assistance to companies in Greece to be able to do green bonds. That's available. The deadline will be October if anyone from the Greek government is here for the next application round. We have all sorts of support mechanisms. I've already mentioned the one in China. The European Investment Bank and the European Bank of Reconstruction Development are now actively supporting green bond programs. I'm doing a workshop on Thursday in Armenia for the EBRD. We have green bonds coming to market funded by the EBRD. And of course, because they have to have 50% lending to green now, they're also becoming cornerstone investors in a lot more green projects. So if you're a biomethane company in Greece at the back there, then I would be suggesting phoning the EBRD as a first port of call to find out what their rates are like, because, you know, Piraeus Bank may actually be cheaper. You've got to check. As part of building up a syndicate of lenders to take it forward. There is preferential capital available. The opportunities for Greece aren't just energy, as I said, although there are some energy areas like grids that have been misunderstood. Under the European taxonomy, all green investments, or grid and transmission investments, count as green. Unless you're building a direct line to a gas plant in the Mediterranean. That won't be allowed. So fossil fuels are exclusions, if you like. Storage, pumped hydro. We have a lot of hydro in Greece. To convert some of that to pumped hydro counts as a green investment. But it's transport too. It's not just EVs, it's shipping. There are criteria about to be published by the European Commission for green shipping, especially electric, low carbon. Aviation, the same. Industrials, steel, chemicals. There are pathways for inclusion. Minerals. The European Commission has just published the Critical Resources Act, which identifies critical minerals for the transition. The nickels, the rare earths, the cobalts of the world. These count as green for the purposes of raising capital. So there are many things that we can do. And of course, the built environment is a really critical area. I take you back to energy efficient buildings, energy efficient air conditioning. And of course, banks' biggest portfolios are property. Greening that property portfolio is a critical part of the transition. I want to mention resilience as well, because as I mentioned, we've lost the fight against climate change. We're going to get heat and various other impacts. We need to prepare. That does mean that investments, port facilities, raising the wharves to be able to deal with storm surges, increased sea levels, thermal insulation being brought in, catchment management, water management systems that make sure we lose less water, because when we have long droughts, we're going to need those water resources there. These qualify as well. We are looking at criteria for social, economic, and biodiversity resilience as well. By the time this is finished, we will need to be applying a climate filter across all areas of the economy. If you are doing the right thing to make yourself future fit, you are effectively reducing your forward risk of default. You are doing something green, which is a proxy for reduced default risk. And that's recognised by Moody's, Fitch's and Standard & Poor's, all of which are joining our resilience steering group for our criteria. This is a credit issue, folks. This is not just a nice to save the planet issue. And it'll become more and more material. And by the way, it'll affect, the resilience issue will affect gas and oil companies too, because as they can show that they're making themselves more resilient to the kinds of climate impacts we're having, whether that be storm surges or whatever, they will reduce their credit risk. It's a simple idea. It's a simple concept. We need to understand how it works. There are enormous opportunities. The next three things to finish up. There will be much more guidance coming through the system. There is clarity of guidance already beginning to appear. And we were having a discussion about fossil fuels earlier. Gas is a challenge. We've now discovered, much to our shock, that the leakage factors and methane from our gas system have been huge over the last 10 years. In fact, climate scientists now say that the biggest challenge in the short term is reducing methane leaking into the atmosphere. The oil and gas system is a big chunk of that. Why? Well, according to satellite mapping that we're now getting irregularly, thanks to a bunch of investments in the last 5 years, we have vast leakage from pipelines, from LNG tankers, and from venting at source. In places like Turkmenistan, Texas, Russia, Indonesia, we have very bad practices around venting, which is essentially releasing gas into the atmosphere because they can't capture it at the same time. And that's leading to plumes of emissions, which are throwing out all our climate models. Unless we get this methane under control, we cannot meet our 2030 targets. There's not just the oil and gas system. There's a whole range of areas. Waste, for example, is a big problem. We have some natural changes. Decomposition of leaf matter in forests is accelerating because of increased CO2 in the atmosphere, creating more methane. We can't control that. It's a function of climate change. It's called a feedback loop. But there are many things we can control. That means that when we calculate the emissions footprint of a gas-fired power station, we now need to be able to calculate the leakage across the pipeline system from venting before we can be sure it's properly low greenhouse gas. In fact, what we now know is that many gas plants have an effective greenhouse gas footprint equivalent to a coal-fired power station. That means that when I was in Warsaw last week, I was making a speech saying, keep the coal plants going, do not replace them with gas. Because you are locking in a 30-year investment where the emission saving is negligible. It's like building a new coal plant. Why bother? We know we have to close the coal plants. It might take us 10 years to do so, but let's work on that and leapfrog instead to renewables, which can include geothermal and hydro. It's not just solar and wind. This is part of the clarity that's coming through thanks to bringing science to the taxonomy. We do need clarity of the pipeline. We need governments to think aggressively about what can be done. The Danish government, the first government of the world that's been elected on a climate platform, has got a plan to build so much offshore wind and replace all their gas plants with offshore wind, in a deal they've done for the unions and of industry, that they say they can power 25%, or they will be able to power by 2035, 25% of Europe's electricity needs on a good day. That is extraordinary. Extraordinary. That is the ambition we need. What they'll be doing is building green hydrogen plants next to the wind farms off the coast of Denmark, so that when that power is not being used by Europe, it'll be converted to green hydrogen, ammonia for industry, for fertilizer replacement, and so on. That is the kind of ambition we need. We have in Greece some of the world's highest irradiation. This is one of the best areas in the world for solar. We need to do some ambitious thinking about how we can use that, use as areas of land that can be converted, avoiding areas of land that we want to keep for other purposes like tourism, etc. What is our strategy? I don't see it. I see a modest strategy. I don't see an ambitious strategy. This is a big opportunity for us. We need, of course, to bring in further incentives. I've talked about DFAs. I've talked about technical assistance. I've talked about credit support. Central banks are moving on this around the world. The European Central Bank is continuing to up its ambition around greening the financial system. But above all, we need to be thinking globally about how this. Greece will not be able to act by itself. Southeast Europe will not be able to act by itself. We do need to be thinking about how we act together. Europe can't save the world. It has to be Europe working with China, the US, and India. Smaller countries have an extraordinarily important role, and I'm counting the UK as a smaller country in this context post-Brexit. Smaller countries have an extraordinarily important role, which is to provide models for other countries to act, for the larger economies, and to lead on the diplomatic initiative. On Monday, I was in Singapore talking to the government and talking to them about the idea of setting up a coalition of smaller countries, because Singapore is now becoming an aggressive green champion, that will drive the change and work in the global architecture, because we also have to think of our global architecture. In a world of climate volatility, of crisis after crisis after crisis, unless the World Food Programme is ready to jump in when there's a famine, unless the World Health Organization has the necessary mandate to properly address pandemics, unless the UN High Commission for Refugees can deal with the increased refugee flows we know we will see chaos for all of us. We will see the Syrian wave of people coming across from Turkey on steroids. And we will see pandemics and war. That's how we experience climate change. In the 1600s, we had climate change. We killed off so many American Indians with smallpox and measles in the 1500s that we saw carbon drawdown, quite hopeful in a way. Forest regrowth in the Amazon was so vast, Stanford University research shows now, because whole civilizations were wiped out by disease, that we cool the planet by 2 degrees. And there's a great book by Geoffrey Parker at Cambridge University called The Global Climate Crisis. In that century, we lost a third of the world's population in Europe, in China and India to famine, pandemics and war, because that is in fact what we experience. This pandemic we saw, expect a lot more according to the IPCC. The war in Ukraine, expect more. How do we prepare? Are we going to allow ourselves to collapse into autarkic states fighting each other? Or are we going to find a way to cooperate globally to ensure we avoid these kinds of catastrophes? I know which path I would choose, and I know which path investors would choose, because investors need a stable world to be able to pay your pensions when you retire. They don't prosper in a world of chaos and crisis. Now that's a role that countries like Greece within the European Union can play to drive change, where the UK can play an important role in the global architecture, and countries like Singapore and so on. This is the big change. This is the millennial challenge for our species. Green bonds are an indicator, a key performance indicator. We need to get money to people doing it, doing the right kinds of things, of course, but there's a bigger story behind it all. Thank you for being willing to be part of that bigger story. We are privileged in this room. There is something we can do in our own work. Most people don't have opportunities to do anything at all. It's that kind of problem. But there is a lot to be done. Thank you. Partnerships is now going to present some material around the green bonds market, some detail. But while she's getting ourselves ready, I'm going to take a question.
Thank you so much for the very inspiring words. I just wanted to ask a bit of a practical question. I think a number of the potential issuers are held back by the fact that what is considered a green bond today is not going to be considered a green bond post the Green Bond EU legislative package. And I think that creates a lot of uncertainty for issuers, because the consequences of marketing something as a green bond and then it not quite being that are grave, both reputationally and in terms of fines. So how would you address those concerns of potential issuers who are scared or hesitant to issue green bonds for that reason?
So the green bond standard is coming in next year in Europe, is a voluntary standard. It's not mandatory. First point to make. It is aspirational. The members of the European Parliament and the Commission agree that it's very difficult to deal with now. We have to do some things, create transition plans, have a better taxonomy before it'll work. We are working this year on reforming the taxonomy. If any of you have been working on applying the taxonomy institution and have some thoughts about how to improve it, let me know, because I'm leading the outreach now about how to improve the taxonomy to make it simpler and easier. Not to sacrifice ambition, to make it easier, because it's ridiculously complicated. The bureaucrats went a bit mad on the detail. Once that taxonomy is easier, it'll become a lot easier to issue green bonds against the green bond standard. At the moment, it's quite difficult, in my view. But the market doesn't stop. Investors want to purchase now. You won't need to meet the European green bond standard to issue bonds, and investors will still buy. I can tell you, because they're buying around the world.
But you can't call them green.
Yes, you can. Absolutely. The green bond standard does not mean that if you call a green bond something without being compliant, it's not a green bond. That does not. It is a voluntary standard. It is an official standard which you can choose to meet. We expect 15% of issuance in Europe next year to be able to be issued under the green bond standard, but probably no more. So it's like an aspirational standard. Let's call it a goal standard for the market.
Sorry, just a follow-up question. Won't the regulators crack down? Sorry, won't the regulators crack down? And we've already seen...
No, they will not in the green bond area. So under disclosure regulations in the SFDR and CSRD and so on, it's a slightly more complicated. You are required to disclose if you're a bank.
Yeah, I'm familiar. Yeah.
But for green bond standard, the regulators will not be cracking down. It's very clear on people who issue a green bond that does not meet the European Green Bond Standard. That is absolutely not the case. No way whatsoever, Jose. The regulator will support a regime of licensed second opinion providers, which I'm sure the Institute will join, and we're going to be negotiating with ESMA, the regulator, to have a support for our existing pool of licensed verifiers to graduate to that scheme. But it is not going to be mandatory. And I also want to stress that for the purposes of the markets, this is future issuance. So there's a standard model. If you issue today, it's still green and it stays in the portfolio. And there's now, we've managed to get through the Parliament, a much better grandfathering clause in the green bond standard. So we expect to have better results. It is impossible for all green bonds to meet the green bond standard next year. We expect over time the market to gravitate in that direction. The regulators will not be penalising people who don't meet the green bond standard. That's the point of it being voluntary. There was a proposal in the European Parliament to make it mandatory. You're perfectly correct, but we managed to kill that last year. I just want to say that because I don't want people to be worried that there's going to be a regulatory push to ensure you comply. There is not going to be an aggressive push. It's very much a soft approach by the Commission and by Parliament and by Member States. I'm happy to keep talking and break about that, by the way, because it's a critically important issue. Yeah, please.
Thank you. Just to piggyback off your question, and just for clarity purposes mostly, how do I understand that the green bond standard will be voluntary? So the interrelation between the green bond standard and the taxonomy as is today, you mentioned earlier, is really, they don't really...
To meet the green bond standard, you need to be able to meet the taxonomy.
Okay.
We are working on simplifying the taxonomy to make that easier for people to, before the green bond standard comes into operation next year. That's how we'll tackle that question. But under the, let's say the SFDR rules, ESMA allows you to qualify as sustainable if you meet the taxonomy or if you meet another recognised sustainability standard, such as climate bond certification.
Right.
In other words, you are not restricted to the taxonomy. And this is a recognition that taxonomy is tough, is a bit too tough. So we have to prove we can make it simple before that'll change.
Thank you.
Any other questions before Elizabeth gets going? Happy to talk about that at break further because, of course, these are very important points for issues.
Great. Thank you. Thanks all. Good morning, everyone. My name is Elizabeth Wisniewska. I head the partnerships team at CBI, which is really the market engagement team. We work with our partner institutions, including banks, asset managers, stock exchanges, to really work together to help mobilize more capital for sustainable finance. And maybe to bring the investor perspective to your question earlier about the green bonds, the investors look at the green bond market in a very global way. And the bond market is a global market. Even euro-denominated bond indices include issuers from all over the world, for example, in the US and Asia. And so reducing the opportunity set from an investment perspective to follow the EU green bond standard, we're very far away from that. So effectively, my job is to look at the market side of things. I've spent many years on the asset management side in fixed income, helping institutional investors like pension funds incorporate environmental considerations into their portfolios. This was in London. I moved to Greece a few years ago, and as someone who spent way too long stuck in the famous Athens traffic this morning, I completely subscribe to Sean's vision of a car-free Athens. Imagine living in the northern suburbs and being able to get to the center without, driving in a very fast manner. It's clear that government intervention, or government support, government policies will be needed to achieve that. How to get Elizabeth from, northern suburbs to Syntagma in under 1 hour without, getting into a fossil fuel-powered car is the dream. So I personally care very much about the evolution of sustainable finance in this part of the world. So there's the government piece, which is very much needed, and there's the markets piece. They both are needed in order to reach our sustainable finance goals. And the markets piece is where I come in. What I wanted to do today is share some statistics on the evolution of the sustainable debt market. As Sean mentioned, we are working to track the market, to research it. By providing more information to the market, we can incentivize investors to invest with confidence. That's also why we, as in basically Sean, created the taxonomy many years ago, because it was a way to give confidence to the market, give confidence to the issuers that they can label something as green with credibility, and give confidence to the investors that they can buy something labeled as green with credibility. And the labeled debt market, including green, but also the sister labels, has developed very quickly, and we now have passed 3.7 trillion US dollars of cumulative issuance since the start of the market. And we can see that in 2022 we had a bit of a drop compared to 2021 figures, which is not surprising. January started off great, and then February happened with Ukraine, the energy crisis, inflation, and a lot of the interest rate rise expectations really slowed down the market. But this whole market still managed to maintain a 5% market share of the overall bond market. So the labeled debt issuance didn't slow down compared to traditional bonds, we foresee that percentage growing. If you need any. If you have any questions on these different labels, green, what's social, sustainability, SLBs, transition, I'm very happy to cover that at some point. If we look at the sort of share of these different labels between themselves, green is still very much the lion's share of this market, but we now have also seen a huge increase in issuance, particularly in social and sustainability bond space. As issuers are really using the flexibility of these different labels. The challenge with social and sustainability is, of course, there's less guidance, there's no taxonomy compared to the green market, which is a lot more developed, and so there's still a lot of work to do in terms of standards to be adopted. And as I was saying, we are now at 3.7 trillion. We publish a report every year where we really look at the whole past year, the trends, who are the top issuers, where the market is going, and this report is coming out on the 19th of April, so very, very soon, and so you will be able to really dig down into the detail of it. If we look on a country-by-country basis, across all these labels, the US was the largest sort of source of issuance, and that's mainly because of the MBS agencies in the US, who are just massive issuers, and of course the supranationals. Interestingly, different countries take the lead when it comes to the different labels. So when it comes to green bonds, the biggest sort of market of issuance is China. The US is the leader when it comes to sustainability. France leads for the social label. SLBs come out more from Italy, effectively, and transition bonds are more of a Japanese territory. If we look at the countries of issuance, I think Greece is around 42nd in the rank of countries, which is of course reflective also of the relative size of the market. We did run some stats. We have a database where we look at any labeled issuance in the world of any size, whether it's green or social sustainability, as long as an issuer labels their bond something, we will take a look and classify whether we agree that it's green, do I agree that it's a social label, sustainability, etc. In the bonds that meet our methodology and align with our taxonomy, this is the list of Greek bonds in our database. So you can see that really the issuance has been picking up since 2019. Half of the market has the CBI certification, which is the stamp that issuers can choose to affix to their bond as an external review that Marina will tell you more about later today. And also we have quite a lot of second-party opinions as well. Energy has been the sort of biggest source the biggest use of proceeds for these greens bonds. But you can see there's also, for example, the Lambda issue that had a broader set of user proceeds. Interestingly, we also have quite a lot of Greek bonds that are issued using a sustainability-linked label. And this is a market that we see is growing a lot, but that also has a lot of caution from the investors, because in the same way that the green bond market really lacked standards 10 years ago, we're now seeing this in SLBs. And this is where we're tackling this head on by working to establish a credible framework for assessing, or rather framework for assessing the credibility of the transition plans of the issuers. You can then issue SLBs on the back of those transition plans. And there's great demand from banks, from investors, for more clarity on this market, because otherwise there's a risk that the SLB issuance is just going to lose credibility effectively. We have, in terms of the themes to come, I think, Sean, you mentioned most of them. In 2023, we're going to be talking about resilience a lot more in the markets, especially as the headlines increase about the effects of climate. You know, the fires in the Athens forests, all over the world. The impact of climate change. SLB, as I mentioned, we are going to be tackling the sort of increased rigor with a huge demand. Policy, we know, is adding a lot of money to the table all over the world, actually also sovereign issuance is a very important point, which is why we're always waiting with great anticipation when the new sovereign comes to the market, because we see that it completely activates the development of the local private market. It really sets the bar for development. And last but not least, one of the things we talk about a lot with investors is transition. In my days of advising asset owners on how to incorporate ESG in their portfolios, one of the simplest way of doing this was just invest out of highly emitting names. All you need to do is remove a few cement companies from your portfolio, and bam, you've got like huge, decarbonization of the portfolio that you can show in your reports. It doesn't decarbonize the planet. We know that by 2030, even 2050, we will still be in cement buildings. We will still probably be flying in planes and using steel. And so now it really is about transitioning the entire economy, the entire activity. Green bonds are great, but they're just the tip of the iceberg. It's not just the bond investors who care, the equity, everybody cares. The whole business models need to change. And this is where there's a huge piece on transition, and including the incorporation of transition by asset owners. So now we've started to see a lot of them incorporate special pockets of investment for transition assets. The challenge for them is, how do they define that without being accused of doing some sort of accounting mumbo-jumbo to invest into highly emitting areas? So it's a huge area of interesting development. And as Sean mentioned, in this part of the world, there's so much more to be done, and investments to come that I think is going to be really interesting to see how that develops in Southeast Europe. So that's it from me. Thank you very much for your time, and looking forward to meeting you later.
Lilia Georgopoulou, Deputy Chief of Listings in Athens Exchange, with strong and long experience also in London Stock Exchange. So, please, Lilia.
Thank you for the introduction, and thanks everyone for being here. It's a great pleasure, and as always, it's a great pleasure to be in the same panel with Sean. Experience has shown that whichever country he shows up, a flourishing green bond market is created. So I'm really hopeful for Greece as well, because definitely the opportunity is here, and the challenge, as we heard. So I really just quickly wanted to run through some of the things we are doing as an exchange, generally in terms of ESG, but also as in terms of green bonds. So we're still in a much earlier stage of development, as also Sean mentioned, but we are slowly seeing the Greek economy pay more attention to ESG and green initiatives. So in 2018, we joined the Sustainable Stock Exchanges Initiative, and since then we have taken some initiatives to encourage sustainable business practices that prioritize long-term value creation over short-term gain. So as a starting point in 2019, We published an ESG reporting guide to encourage our listed and non-listed companies to disclose material ESG information according to regulation and recently published international standards. And it's actually very encouraging that our guide has been downloaded more than 8,000 times. And to put that into context, we only have 140 listed companies, so that's quite a lot. Then in 2021, we launched an ESG index to track the stock market performance of listed companies. And the index started its first year only with 35 companies included, and now it has more than 60 companies in the index. So again, we see that this development with more and more companies and investors paying attention to ESG. And then most relevant to our discussion today, in last year, we also launched a segment of our website and market dedicated to green bond and sustainability-linked bond and all kinds of ESG bond issuance. So essentially there we display all the information related to those issuances along with the relevant documentation and certification. For the issuers, it's a way to get visibility and communicate to the investment community their ESG strategy and commitments. And for the investors, it gives them access to consolidated and easily comparable information on investable ESG instruments. Overall, green bonds have emerged as a powerful tool in the fight against climate change, as they offer a way to channel capital towards sustainable development, promote transparency, and incentivize businesses and governments to take concrete actions to reduce their environmental impact. The growth of the green bond market, as we heard, has been nothing short of remarkable, and is a testament to the global commitment to sustainability. So now, specifically for Greece, the country has made significant progress in terms of promoting green investments and reducing its carbon footprint. The country has set a target of producing 35% of its energy from renewable sources by 2030. However, more needs to be done so that the country meets its sustainability targets. And this is where green bonds can come in, both for companies and the government that are looking to finance green projects. They can issue green bonds and list them on the exchange. They're an effective tool for issuers to raise capital at a lower cost, as Sean has mentioned, and consequently, they can attract a wider pool of investors, which can help diversify the investor base and reduce dependence on traditional forms of financing. But at the same time, listing of green bonds helps improve the transparency and credibility of green projects and provides a way for investors to support such projects with positive environmental impact. As you can see, we have, at the moment, 5 green and sustainability-linked bonds listed on the exchange. You can see that most of them have been issued in 2021, which was a good year for green bond issuance. Most of them are from energy companies, but we also have 3 that are from real estate project development companies. So quite a mix of use of proceeds. And as you can see, we have one, the Terna one, which is a sustainability linked bond. So the size of the market on the exchange is just over 1.1 billion. And we remain hopeful that going forward, and hopefully after the government also issues its announced green bond, the market will continue to go from strength to strength. And I'm just going to finish here saying that as an exchange, we are hoping that going forward, all bonds are green bonds without even the need for a label, and where ESG is just business as usual. Thank you.
Ready for questions, ladies and gentlemen?
Can we ask them a question?
Yes, ask them a question.
Yes, of course.
Do we have any investors in green bonds in the room? And who could share some thoughts on investing in Greek or European green bonds?
I had a separate question, but I can wait. So it's mostly, well, for all of you, really. So in terms of the oil and gas industry, because that's where we're from, our background is anyway. In terms of, thank you, CCS projects and carbon capture projects, we understand that it's quite difficult to benefit from a green bond, unless there are certain very sort of tight criteria that we adhere to. And we'd be hoping if you could sort of elaborate on those points a little bit further.
Let me dive in. Please prepare your next question. Hopefully, you get a couple more questions. CCS, we've been very clear in the European taxonomy, in other places, has an important role to play. We have to do everything. Unfortunately, we don't have the opportunity to only do the really green stuff. We can't, well, we might be able to change the world in solar, but we're not going to, because the world's not going to work that way. I say that because there is a very interesting book by Stanford University Professor Mark Jacobson, which I'm in the middle of reading, which essentially models out how we could shift the entire planet's energy system to renewable energy by 2035. It's very interesting. It just shows you it's theoretically possible, technically possible, and we have the capital to do it. But that would require energy policy changes in all countries. And as you know, energy policy changes are actually not the subject of science, they're the subject of vested interests, legacy interests, and a bunch of other stuff. But it's messy. It's messy. And I say that having come from Indonesia, where half the cabinet own shares in coal plants and coal mines. And it's one of the things underpinning the background story in Indonesia, which is that they're going to keep using coal to 2080. They won't, for a variety of reasons. We need to try every single thing we can in that context. It certainly means direct air capture, like I mentioned. It means carbon capture and sequestration, which will work in a variety of ways. But we need rules that ensure we're not leaking. Leakage is the biggest thing. We've had a collaboration with the Global Carbon Capture and Sequestration Institute recently. And when I've started talking to CCS plants, I've discovered leakage factors are not modest. In the European taxonomy, we said that in the transportation of carbon between extraction and sequestration, you can lose no more than 5%. So American CCS projects are losing 50%. 50%! What the hell? That's not carbon capture and sequestration. That's carbon capture greenwashing or something like that. It's absurd. So we need to have proper technical standards, which you'll appreciate in the gas and oil industry are the norm, normally. This is our challenge. We do not expect, but there's no rules against it, CCS to be used for the power sector. The coal sector has not done this, right? It just hasn't actually happened. It's been a talk, they've been talking about it for 20 years. In the gas sector, there's, blue hydrogen, which is where you use carbon capture and sequestration to capture emissions from gas plants while you're creating hydrogen. If it works, hey, that's fine. But you want to make sure there is no leakage anywhere. And one of the biggest areas I mentioned earlier of leakage is transportation methane. If you've got short distance methane, that could work. So I think Abu Dhabi will be able to make it work because they're extracting gas offshore. They've got control over the pipeline. They can make sure the emissions leakage is low, and it's pipeline, it's not ships. And then they can manage the plant. And then they will create green ammonia. And the leakage from green ammonia is trivial. So you can ship ammonia around the world shifting hydrogen's a bit harder because hydrogen is also a greenhouse gas. And now the science is a little bit tricky around leakage factors on hydrogen as you ship it around. I had a very interesting conversation in Tokyo a few weeks ago with Kawasaki Heavy Industries, who are they're building ships to ship hydrogen. They have not looked at leakage at all. If you look at Nature magazine, you'll see a whole lot of articles around leakage. I don't think it's certain yet. All I'm saying is it's a risk factor. And when you've got a risk factor around emissions, we have to use the precautionary principle. We don't do it till we're sure. So there's a challenge in that area.
Sean?
CCS will be used for direct air capture,
Like-
mostly, which is about how we take carbon out of the atmosphere and then bury it. And the first project's being done at the moment in Texas around this. Sorry, Leon, my apologies. Go
I
ahead.
was gonna say, could this be instead a candidate for a sustainability-linked bond, where you use that to hit some KPIs of carbon reduction or something similar?
So I guess our view about sustainability bonds, and this is exemplified in the entities and SLB certification scheme we're launching next week. Yeah, it is next week, isn't it, Marina? Is that what counts is what the company's doing, and is it in line with what our climate targets? In other words, there isn't a get out of jail clause. If what you're doing is consistent with climate targets, then you could use an entity bond or a SLB as part of it. But you've got to make sure your KPIs are properly in line. So I would say, first in terms of CCS, CCS is included in the EU taxonomy, very clear. There are rule sets there. You can do it now as a straight use of proceeds bond. You could include it in an entities or an SLB bond, it's relevant, but you need to be making sure you're addressing leakage factors. You have to, and it's about proof, it's not about promises. That's the challenges. So in that sense, I'm not so sure it'll be different doing an SLB versus a green bond. The key point about an SLB, it's the company. So this is the transition plan. So Elizabeth talked about transition plans and the transition model. One thing we are doing at Climate Bonds is if you are a company of high carbon, but you've got a CapEx plan to shift to low carbon in a reasonably fast period, let's say 7 years, which is in line with what the science says we've got to do, then you can get a transition certification and be part of the climate green universe. You are a subset, you are not separate. Because what we're saying to all investors is, for our climate lending, we need to not only invest in green companies, we've got to invest in the high carbon companies that are changing. That's where we're going to have real impact. It's all part of addressing climate. And there'll be a transition to resilience aspect that'll start coming through as well. That's such a long-winded way of saying it's in. Which means you could do it, potentially. So your CCS bits would be in, the gas plant might not be, unless you're doing something like blue hydrogen, which you could do because you've got fairly short distances between extraction and utilisation, and using pipelines where the leakage factors are much more controllable than shipping. So there's a possibility. So green transition bond coming through, I think. Yeah.
Thank you. You asked earlier if there are any investors here. We represent investors who are looking to invest in green bonds, as well as developers in green energy. I have two questions. One is, by the way, I'm coming from Cyprus, which is a place where, our government was trying to issue sovereign green bonds by the end of the year. They haven't as yet. There are many concerns, and my question would be how best to consult places like Cyprus or other smaller countries in their pathway towards issuing green bonds. And the other one was storage is always a big problem, and I know, and please correct me if I'm wrong, that there are plans of creating storage in the sea. I think certain investors are gathering in Israel to develop these plans, but I think it would be one of the issues that need to be addressed when green bonds are being designed and issued. What do you think?
Marina, by the way, is our head of certification, is based in Cyprus. We've got a follow-up conversation.
Thank you, Marina. We met last year in another.
That was scary. For small countries, the first thing is anyone can participate in green finance. Where there is finance, it can be green. Now, is that a bond, or is that a loan, or is that equity? These are all open questions. There is a sustainable loan market globally, which is actually bigger than the green bond market, especially in places like China, where there are 10 times as many sustainable loans as bonds. And this is bilaterals, that's all it is. And there are incentives. You know, some banks in Europe, like Natixis and Crédit Agricole, have internal risk weighting to encourage their loan officers to issue sustainable loans, some of which are certified by climate bonds. So there's lots of options available, so on. On the equity side, we now have many more investors trying to green their equity portfolios in line of taxonomies as well, which opens up further opportunities. And one of the reasons we're rolling out entity certification for companies is not just to support all of their debt issuance, but to also allow them to use the confirmation of alignment with climate change targets in broader capital raising. So there's stuff you can do. Now, clearly, the scale at which you can do debt will be determined by the market in which you're trying to issue into. If you're trying to issue into global markets, you know, less than 500 million people are less interested. I met with Barclays Treasury on Monday, who are very keen on green sovereigns from any country in any currency, by the way. So that's quite handy for some people in Southeastern Europe. But they want scale. They can't they can't participate in 150 million euro deals. They need 400 million euro deals. So that's a challenge, of course. Mind you, sovereigns can often do that. The challenge that sovereigns face, and I want to stress that for sovereigns, every single sovereign we've worked in, and we're about to hit 50 sovereigns issuance later this year, have done green programs, which is half the world's regular bond issuers in sovereigns. So it's quite a milestone. Every sovereign has been resistant in advance and been enthusiastic afterwards. They always find it hard. Treasuries say, well, hypothecation's the thing we hate. We don't want to do hypothecation. We don't want to do a carve-out. But the feedback they get and the market feedback is always positive, and they always become enthusiastic. The primary problem that all sovereigns face is a lack of things to justify more issuance, which is the pressure we want to create. That's exactly what we try to do, to get them to hunt for more. And I know the Greek PDMO is already looking forward because they're very enthusiastic about the idea about where they're going to get investments in the future once it gets going. So in Europe, half the sovereign issuers have stalled on issuance. Spain, for example, France, the UK too, because they can't find enough things to support the green bond issuance. Some are doing better than others. So that's a great position. The European Commission has got the world's largest sovereign equivalent program. They're going for 250 million to fund the Resilience and Recovery Fund, and they will be able to find the projects. So for small countries, it's really a matter of where they issue and how they issue. There should be no barriers apart from what they can find in their portfolio. And we're helping some countries locate what they can find. We've helped Thailand, for example. We helped I'm on the advisory committee for the French sovereign and the UK sovereign, for example. There's things we can do to make it easier, hunting through the... So that could be a conversation you and Marina could have afterwards and see whether there's something we could do to help the Cyprus government. But there's no doubt that if Cyprus would issue, they're going to find it positive. And it's going to be a very good reputational issue for the government.
Sean, I just wanted to add to what you said, that the problem with sovereign bonds, as you quite rightly pointed out, is that they do not have enough suitably qualified projects to invest. And the reason why is, in the case of the EU countries, is they get a lot of money from various funds and divisions within the EU to green projects. So when they issue a sovereign green bond, they cannot include them in the funding. So before issuing the bond, they have really to decipher within the government system which projects have not applied or are likely to get money from the EU or any other sources, so they can put them aside and justify them for green finance?
I suspect it's simpler than that, to be honest. Look, if I buy an electric vehicle with my own cash, and then I decide to get a loan to refinance it, that qualifies. So if I get money from a European green program to grow renewable, and I own the renewable plant, I can refinance it in the green bond market. So I actually suspect the government's worrying too much about that. I'm sure there's ways of making it work. This market is not quite so hard and fast about the detail of it. If you own the asset, it qualifies. It's as simple as that. And how you got to own the asset is a separate issue. So there's lots of ways through it. Resilience is another area which will become useful. As we develop resilience criteria, this will open up more areas of inclusion for sovereigns in particular, particularly in emerging markets, where mitigation may not be quite as a large a volume as in some of the bigger countries. Now, what does resilience mean? Well, clearly adaptation measures, investment in firefighting counts as the simplest. That's trivial, I know, but thermal, the built environment issues. But when we start looking at what we have to do to survive climate change, we're talking about how societies bounce back. That's really what we're talking about. In the pandemics, we learned, for example, that helicopter money is actually quite important. Being able to pay out money to small businesses and families when they're stuck at home to make sure they keep buying food is actually a critical resilience investment. If you're creating a government fund to be able to do that in these crises that are going to keep coming through 3 years, you know what? That's a climate resilience investment, as an example. Education. There is a direct correlation between the fragility of an economy and a society and inequality. The more equal it is, the less likely it is to be knocked over in a crisis. Think Somalia and Syria, I guess. How do we address those? Well, one of the key things you can do to improve equality in a society is educate primary education of women. That has the most substantial impact of pretty well everything, really. Because as you educate women, they participate more in the economic life of society, they start small businesses, and so on. And this, the evidence out of Bangladesh in particular is very, very clear on this. So if you get more women starting small businesses, there are a few things that happen, which is a function of primary education pretty directly. One is it changes the nature of economic activity. You get a lot more small business activity, and women tend to be better at small business. You change the financial stability of the whole microfinance sector. The default rate for microfinance lending to businesses run by women is 3%. The default rate for microfinance lending for businesses run by men on average globally is 20%. Whoa! Whoa! Suddenly I've got a really good argument for central banks to say, if you want to ensure the financial stability of the economic system when you've got inclusion criteria coming in, you actually want to help primary education of women. And that's a resilience activity. So you've got an example of where we're going on the resilience sector. So this is going to take a couple of years to build the evidence base around all of these, because it's got to be properly scientifically rooted. This is the principle here. But that also opens up further investment opportunities for sovereigns to say, actually, we're doing things which are material. We hadn't quite thought of them that way, and we might have to change the parameters a bit, like building codes, for example, or tax credits for buildings that are super energy efficient, for example. Then that would then qualify as the climate resilience. So the opportunities for the likes of Cyprus will grow to be able to include things in their portfolio, is really what I'm trying to say.
Any other question, ladies and gentlemen?
Nearly ready for coffee.
I'd like to thank the panelists, John, Elizabeth, and Lilian. Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much. Time for coffee, and we'll continue after 15, 20 minutes. Thank you.